Welcome to our 114th Europe Calling. And those who have been here already in the past, they normally saw Sven Giegold here at this moment. And you may have noticed that I'm not Sven Giegold. I'm Maximilian. I'm a co-worker of Sven and was always in the background at Sven's seminars. And in my new role, I'm managing director of Europe Calling, the association. We have others from our board here, Nina, for example, whom you can see, Alexandra and others are in the audience. And we are now an association, a not-for-profit association. And I'm saying this for all those who don't know it already, because this was necessary, because when Giegold is now in the Ministry for Climate Protection and the Economy, so he's not an MEP any longer. That's why we had to set up a foundation so that we can, an association, so that we can continue Europe Calling. This is number one, Europe Calling as an association, and we're really looking forward to discussing with you at this first webinar of Europe Calling as an association. Thank you very much. We had 1,087 founding sponsors who give regular donations to us. That was necessary for us to be able to establish the association and be able to continue the Europe Calling discussions. That's thanks to you. Thank you very much. And you can still support us more if you want. And I'm going to post the link for that. This is a relative cheeky advertisement. I'm allowing myself here. And I'm going to tell you also, I would like to tell you that under the F&A section, you can also ask questions. You can also ask oral questions. Then you have to click on the raise hand button. And I would also like to say that we register the seminar and post it later online. So if you participate with your name will appear. And if you belong to an organization or a company, you should say that so that it is transparent who is with us today. And now for everything else, I leave the floor to Alexandra Geese, MEP, founding member of Europe Calling and negotiator for the Digital Services Act of the EU. Have fun. Thank you very much, Max. I'd also like to wish you all a very warm welcome. On behalf of Europe Calling, Max has already introduced me. My name is Alexandra Geese. As you've heard, European Parliament member. I'm not Sven either, but I hope we can also do a good job on his behalf tonight. And I'd like to welcome you to the first webinar of Europe Calling, which is dedicated to the one issue I'm very occupied with in the European Parliament at the moment, the digital constitution of Europe, or the constitution for the internet. And here you may ask, does the internet really need a constitution? I would say yes, and this will be the topic for our discussion tonight, because a basic law or a constitution is something we're very proud of in Europe. It's the basis for our democracy, and so far in Germany, it helped us a lot. The question is now, can the European legislation also reach such high standards? The law is called Digital Services Act, and this is a very comprehensive regulation for digital platforms. Digital platforms have a huge influence on our democracy because they form opinions. But the opinion formation taking place there is not a neutral thing that happens in a public place, but it happens in a space of the private economy or inside several places or spaces of the private economy. There is no transparency or not enough transparency, and the companies have become huge, and we don't really know what opinions are carried on. We have some anecdotes We have also evidence coming from one person who is here today, Frances Hogan. I'm going to introduce to you soon. We're very thankful to her because she proved that what we have already sensed is actually true. That's why we need this digital constitution with rules for a functioning democracy so that everybody can have a say. And our constitution in Germany comprises also several provisions about how our economy is to function. And that's also an interesting aspect we will also touch upon today. For example, the question how the business model functions behind the internet, the advertising market, and what this has to do with our freedom of the press. These are things we want to discuss tonight, and we will see whether the Digital Services Act in its current form can master this test, can really become the digital constitution of Europe. And we have three high-level guests tonight who will receive the floor for 10 minutes. It's an honor for me to present them tonight. I start with Felix Kartte from Reset Tech, senior advisor for Reset in Germany. He works in Berlin. Reset is an international initiative which advocates digital democracy. The focus of his work is research and advice for systematic approaches for the regulation of big tech and surveillance capitalism. You probably remember the great webinar we had with Shoshana Zuboff, the great theoretician on surveillance capital here at Europe Calling. She actually wrote me today and wished us good luck for this seminar today. And before, Felix was at the European External Action Service, which is more or less the EU Foreign Office, where he worked in the field of disinformation and the protection against digital influencing. We're very happy to have you here today, Felix. Then we have Peter Pomerantsev. Peter Pomerantsev is author, journalist, and film producer. He studied English literature in German in Edinburgh, and then worked in Moscow as a TV producer. Today, he's senior fellow at the SNF Agora Institute of the Johns Hopkins University, and is the director of the IRENA initiative for digital disinformation, on digital disinformation and polarization. He was an advisor for the British government and the US Congress, and he wrote two books. One is called This Is Not Propaganda, and the other is entitled Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. These books received several awards, and I have to make a little bit advertisement here at this point. I think his book, This Is Not Propaganda, is a really great book because he manages to develop the question what all this means for the political sphere, all these networks, what it means also for political decisions and strategies. He explains it in a very concise way and embeds his theories in stories from all over the world. So I'm very, very happy that you're with us tonight, Mr. Pomerantsev. Thanks for being here. And then last but not least, Frances Hogan. Frances Hogan is well known for being a Facebook whistleblower. And last year, she informed in a comprehensive way on what is happening at Facebook and what Facebook conceals. And she submitted evidence, an enormous amount of documents. She traveled all over the world. She gave testimony in the US before Congress. It was in Great Britain, here in Brussels. She spoke in the European Parliament in a brilliant and very professional way and gave account of all these practices which are used at Facebook. And she also showed us what possible solutions could be. She is a computer scientist and studied at the Harvard Business School, worked for a whole wealth of digital companies, Yelp, Pinterest, and so on. And between 2018 and 2021, She was leading product manager at Facebook in the team for civic misinformation, which was to tackle disinformation and hate speech in social networks. And then we have another guest, which cannot be here for family reasons, but sent us a video. The French digital minister, Frederic O, who in the framework of the French Council presidency will lead the trilogue, i.e. the discussions or negotiations which will take place as from next week between Parliament and Council on the Digital Services Act, because the two texts that were adopted by the Parliament on the one hand and the Council on the other hand are very different. As from Monday, we will negotiate in this famous trilogue, as it is called in European jargon, and Monsieur O will be in the lead here for these discussions in the Council. Well, and after this, we have ample time, as usually, for questions from you all. But now we will start with our first keynote speech. Felix Kartte, you have the floor. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to give me the occasion to speak here. Alexandra said I should also present empirical facts here a little and talk on the data situations, give evidence on why we need this new digital constitution for Europe. I'm not a master of PowerPoint presentations, but I have a PowerPoint presentation here with me, which I'm going to click through. It's not a very long presentation, and I would need the second slide now. I have divided my talk into 4 problem areas, which we have to tackle in one or the other way. First of all, the first big issue is content moderation. Here we have to find how do platforms do this, which are the legal criteria, then the algorithms which decide which contents are reinforced, the recommender systems, then linked to this the issue of surveillance advertising, which leads to far too much control in my mind. And then I would also touch on the financial incentives, monetary incentives, which arise through the business model of the large platforms for hate for profit or hate as a business model. Here, I need the next slide. Great, thank you. So there are 2 criteria, 2 dimensions according to which platform operators moderate user content on the platforms. The first dimension is the first usage rules of the platform operators. And here one has to say that it is desirable that platforms can also prohibit content, even though we have freedom of opinion. If we want to have a digital environment in which everybody can participate and feel safe, nobody has to be afraid of mobbing. I think about young women, for example. So when anorexia is glorified, then there has to be means to do something against that. But then it's also very important, because what I do as a platform operator is at first just a promise, but it's important that we also put all these things into practice, i.e. what we promise has to become reality. Which is very often not at all the case. All our investigations show this. There is a lot of lack of transparency and data are not very often just not disclosed for research work. Then we have also to speak about the reach of extreme right and conspiracy content on certain platforms. In March and April already. Facebook announced that pages will be reduced as to their reach, which disseminate fake or misleading content on COVID-19, on the pandemic, because these pages have normally have usually increased their reach lately. And then we have also the spying problem, which I'm going to speak about soon. The AfD politicians have found a medium here to disseminate the conspiracy theories, which even question whether the pandemic is real. And now I would like to show the next slide. I would say that this massive dissemination of fake news has also an impact on the real world. We have a study which showed that in Germany, even in Germany, you may say, internet users, there are many internet users which believe that the pandemic is just fake. So the second yardstick for content moderation, which is maybe even more important, this is the criminal law. According to criminal law, there are certain contents which are hate speech, etc., which are prohibited, which are banned. And in Germany, we have our network execution law, according to which operators of platforms have certain obligations after they are notified. But the question is, how serious will this be taken by Facebook? Will they comply with these provisions? Only a little over 50% of clearly illicit contents which have been notified are taken off, as we know, which means that the AI systems used by Facebook are often not good enough, but at the same time, the company just does not want to put in the money which would be necessary to use more human aid. So we believe that we need minimum standards, legal minimum standards. And now I'm not going to read all these examples which refer to German politicians, which these are quotes we found on public Facebook websites during the election campaign. And we also had a poll about women between 18 and 33, and we have a high percentage of women who have already been sexually harassed. So digital violence in the network is something which is not always said openly. So when we have posts, because people do not always admit it when they have become a victim here, the figures are not necessarily correct. Then the recommender systems I've already mentioned, according to which the dissemination of content is steered. Facebook has a lot of suppositions about our individual preferences and bases its decisions on this. They try to fixate our attention on the screen in order to target advertising towards us. I think we're going to hear much more here from other speakers. And here I would like to show a very simple example here on the left-hand side. If I just input IMF vaccine in Facebook groups, I receive all these recommendations you can here see of anti-vaxxers, which abound with misinformation and hate speeches. Then on Instagram, we made up an account and defined it in the configuration as minor of age. And then we clicked on several pages with pornorexia content, which disseminated such pornorexia content. And we found what we can see here on the picture. These were the profiles which Instagram sent us, even though we had indicated that we were minor of age. So we would need the next slide now, please. Thank you. This one, yes. Our data profiles, user profiles, are not used by Facebook for our user feeds, but are sold. Facebook and others sell these to the advertising industry. And here the potential for abuse is great. Cambridge Analytica showed this, but we have other examples which unfortunately lead us to the conclusion that Facebook has not learned the lesson. One example with a German video at the beginning of the last year, we bought a Facebook advertisement as a test with illicit hate speeches, and in the configurations we sent via the configurations we sent them to AfD electors. They never reached these people because we canceled them before they reached them, but we could find out that Facebook authorized them. So it's interesting that there is not really any duty of care. And now the next slide, please. Thank you. The fourth point I'd like to speak about is the financial or pecuniary incentives, which lead Facebook to close their eyes towards hatred and hate speech. Here, one example. Here you can see how this all works. In an automated way, there are ads which are shown on certain web pages. Unfortunately, all sorts of contents can be disseminated here. Here you have on the right hand advertisement for legal, and on the left you have all these hate messages. And here O2 advertising on a page which says that COVID vaccine is the new world abortion weapon. And the customers have no control over all this. They don't know where their advertisements will be shown. I don't think they would find this very funny if they see that their brands are shown here next to such messages. So here we really need some transparent way to check all these things. And here my last slide, here on the right, more advertisements on Facebook, and here an estimate of the Center for Countering Digital Hate. They say that in the US alone, Facebook and Instagram alone earn probably around $1.1 billion per year with vaccine, with anti-vaxxers. So that's just another example that shows that ad tech works thanks to web pages, which well, a second example which shows that ad tech earned around $36 million in 2021 with websites with misinformation on the climate crisis.
Thank you, Felix. Yes, that was a ton of facts. Thank you very much. But we have some time to talk some more. Peter Pomerantsev, we can't see you at the moment. Your camera is off, but it's your turn.
There you are. Great.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me?
We hear you perfectly. We saw Felix presenting many of the bad practices of social networks. So our question to you would go in the direction, what does it do to politics? What happens with the political world because of this? And you have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. It's a huge honor to really, I think, meet Francis for the first time, who's really done such amazing work to help explain to us the inner workings of these companies and really guide our thinking about what to do with it. I'm going to do the opposite of Felix. Felix had loads of slides. As a man of from a serious think tank and bureaucracy, he has to have that. These days I'm sort of an academic, but I'm still really a writer. So I don't have to have PowerPoints. So yeah, I mean, in my last book, This Is Not Propaganda, I wanted to speak to the people who then use these tools for political campaigns. I was very fascinated by, if you are running a political campaign, whether you're, I don't know, promoting political Islam, and I spoke to people who create those sort of campaigns, or people who drive elections, or extremists. How do you use these new tools? And how does this technology change your strategy? And how does that strategy change kind of your ideas? And there's a way of looking at political ideas, not as the ideas come first and they're pushed into the technology, but the other way around. The technology and the nature of that technology produces political concepts. We can go deep into history. There's a whole school of thoughts that says the idea of the nation arises because of the creation of the printing press, which organizes society in certain ways. But without getting into that kind of like old history, in my research, I talked to a lot of political strategists and campaigners, and what came out was a way of understanding what we now describe as populism, the Salvinis of this world, the Trumps of this world, the Brexits of this world, etc., not purely as a crisis of culture and ideas, but also as something that is produced by the technology. So this first came to me when I was sitting in Mexico City with a Spanish, in Britain we call them spin doctors, in Russian they're called political technologists. I don't know what the German word is actually. Maybe you can maybe you can explain to me, but the guy who kind of runs the campaigns for a lot of populist movements in Latin America. And he was saying, look, you have to stop thinking of populism as an idea. Populism is a strategy, and it's a strategy that's born out of my reality of how to use social media. Social media is now what defines a campaign. The balance is tipped. It was TV for a long time. Now social media is more important. It drives it. And think about it, he said, I'm a campaigns guy. I've got the Facebook toolkit in front of me, and he worked in societies where Facebook was the most important tool. And he said, look, I can't define voters anymore by class. Class has disappeared as a meaningful behavioral predictor. Left and right economics don't mean anything anymore. These aren't things that define people. What I know is that they are in different groups on Facebook. They're defined by their little interests. Some of those interests are very political, like immigration, easy. Other things are quite private, like potholes, or something to do with animal rights. And I've got this huge map of interests around me, and I have to find a way to create a campaign that will do a different message to every one of these groups, that will get them motivated. They have nothing in common with each other. So specific enough to target each one, but is vague enough to bring them all together into one sort of vague block, one emotion around which they can relate to. This is not the same as building coalitions. Yeah, building coalitions is when you have different groups, you bring them together, you find what the commonalities are, you make rational arguments. That's the classic work of building coalitions. This is different. You don't want these different groups to ever meet. You don't want them to see each other. You want to go as micro as you can to find the one little message that will work for a group in a certain place of a certain demographic. And he said, look, I have to find these little messages that will work and bring them together in a vague idea of the people. You know, it's something very, very vague. When he says, I use a term like the people, it's not a sign of society coming together, the opposite. It's a sign of society being so distributed, so diverse, that I have to invent an abstract concept that they can imagine themselves into. Not a sequence of ideas, just an idea of the people. And somewhere, of course, is the anti-people, the elites, the foreigners, whoever, the enemy around which you can express all your very different frustrations. It's the enemy that's, you know, at fault for immigration, or at fault for your potholes, or at fault for all the different things you care about. Yeah, you've got to take these discrete little things and relate them to an abstract enemy. Now, you know, we can take many examples of this from, you know, a 5-star in Italy, obviously Trump in America, but something I really explored a lot was Brexit in Britain. And I interviewed the guy who ran the digital campaign for Brexit. And he continued this story that I'd heard in Mexico, but he gave it great detail. So he was like, look, for a country of, I think, around 20 million, you need around 80 different messages, completely contradictory ones, yeah? And, you know, so you know, sometimes it's very easy, you know, for the people who are against immigration in Britain, you said the EU and membership in the EU is at fault for immigration. That's easy. But he said that's not enough. That wouldn't be enough people to win the Brexit campaign. And so I asked him, so what were the other sorts of groups you tapped into? And he said, by far and away, the most successful group that he could get out to vote was people who cared about animal rights. Animal rights has nothing to do with Brexit. You know, it's unrelated. His job was to take something people cared about and create a very specific campaign saying the EU is horrible to animals. And there were very famous ads, very, very targeted ads saying the EU is cruel to animals because it sponsors farms that create bulls for bullfighting. Or the EU laws insist that animals have to be transported before they are slaughtered, which means they're transported in unethical ways across the continent. So he did this campaign just about animal rights for that group. The people who care about animal rights are not the same people who care about immigration. They probably would not like each other if they ever met. The idea is to keep them separate and do these very, very different campaigns for all of them. And then obviously you have this very vague slogan, take back control, which can mean anything to anyone, with the EU as this abstract enemy that whatever grievance you have, you can project yourself into it. So that's the technology, yeah? And, you know, this idea all the time that you have to create a notion of the people that is abstract enough for all these different groups to imagine themselves part of being. Now, but what's the problem with it? You know, politics is always looking to bring in different groups. In a sense, you know, politics has always been about that. I think there's 2 or 3 very, very, very big problems. And they're again to do with the technology. Some of them Felix has talked about engagement and emotion, but let's do the other ones. Because these different bits of society aren't talking to each other, because we as journalists don't know which message is being sent to who, it's all in the dark. Certainly was during Brexit. We can't have a public debate about it. You know, one part of society doesn't know why another part of society is voting. Journalists have no idea what the agenda is that's being pushed in different directions. The other parties don't know what is being said to who. So the idea of a public sphere where we debate these things, where we have a conversation about it, that disappears. Dark ads, and sometimes these things are known as dark ads, lead to a society in the dark. So in Britain, we spent 5 years after Brexit trying to work out, what did we vote for? Because we did not know. Was it sovereignty? Was it animal rights? Was it immigration? We could not agree for 5 years what we voted about. I'm not saying it was a good or bad vote. I'm saying for public discourse, for democratic discourse, you cannot have this world where different messages are being sent to different groups and we can't have a discussion about it. It's also takes away the democratic rights of the people who are receiving these messages. We don't know if I'm being sent one thing and the other person is being sent another one. I don't know if like the campaign that's targeted as me is this party saying something completely different to my neighbor. Yeah. So my kind of democratic right, and it's the democratic right to information, is being stripped away. I also don't know which of my personal data has been used to target me. Why am I seeing this message? How much was spent on it? So we, essentially we're a society in the dark in these sorts of conditions. So look, today is about talking about, the Digital Services Act, about the Democratic Action Plan. I hope I'm not going too fast for the interpreter. I'm trying to repeat myself all the time to let the interpreter catch up. But what can we do about it? I don't know if we're going to have a big debate today about, is targeted advertising something to ban? I'm going to go right in there and say, I don't think we should ban it. I don't think that's the problem. Greenpeace used targeted advertising. Everybody uses targeted advertising. There's nothing wrong with reaching people. The problem is the architecture and the lack of transparency about how it's done. We should all know which messages are being sent to who, so as a public we can react to that and enter a discussion. I should know if I'm being targeted with something, what the same party is telling the other people. The other party should have a chance to respond. That basic potential for public discourse has disappeared, and I think when we think about regulation, that should be our first stop. How do we create a genuine public sphere again? And when I say public sphere, I mean it very much in the German Habermasian sense. So that's, I think, the direction to go in, but I'm willing to have a debate about whether we just ban targeted advertising. It's a debate that's we're having a lot of, but let's talk about that as we move forward.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. That was extremely insightful. I think especially in terms of how political strategy is being adapted to the way social media works, to the targeting system. And by the way, I'm a big fan of banning targeting, but we can have that discussion later. And I think we will have other opportunities to have it. Before we go into that discussion, I'm delighted to give the floor to our heroine, I think, tonight, Frances Hogan. What are your insights? What can you tell us about these topics? What do you think about what Peter said? I remember one of the Wall Street Journal articles, which were based on your revelations, which said there was a BuzzFeed editor at a certain point who complained to Facebook that only very extremist content and content featuring fierce emotions like hate and anger and fear got visibility on Facebook, while telling people, well, you should do yoga and be on a great diet, didn't work at all.
You can't steal all my greatest hits before I start talking. But thank you for the intro. And I'm so grateful for both Felix, the facts that Felix brought to the forefront, and Peter's characterization around this. It is a fundamental issue about our democracies. And he opened with exactly one of the most important concepts for us all to touch on, which is, yes, social media is altering how our democracies work. And this has happened over and over again. We had a different, the rise of the printing press allowed us, period, to have democracies at scale because people had access to information. Fundamental in democracies is the idea that individuals can make meaningful decisions, and that we should have a society that allows people to have a say in shaping those decisions. If people don't have access to high quality information, that means information that is about our shared reality, right? When we have our own facts, that is not shared reality. That is, it does not align with the ability to have a democracy. This idea that Facebook is changing our democracy, each time one of these new mass mediums arises, we face the same things. And in the past, we've gone through different kinds of societal changes in response to each of those evolving technologies. That when we had the rise of very cheap newspapers, right, we had to go through and ask questions about what is the role of what we say in English, yellow journalism, because literally newspapers caused wars. Because people claimed that countries attacked other countries and people rushed into violence. And people stepped back and said, we need to develop rituals and infrastructures and institutions around how we train journalists to be responsible, because we see the consequences. With the rise of things like radio stations and television stations, in the United States, we began to formulate laws around transparency in ownership. The idea that once you can reach lots and lots of people in a way that might not be obvious, that you had to disclose who owned these agents of information dissemination. Just as each of those times we responded as a society to protect our democracy as new ways of disseminating information arose, we need to again step in and say, what are the appropriate rituals, institutions, rules, systems that allow us to coexist as an effective democracy with these new forms of technology? It's not just Facebook, it's TikTok, it's all these forms of social media. So I want to give a little more depth and richness to what Felix talked about in terms of what we call engagement-based ranking. So engagement-based ranking is, Facebook calls it meaningful social interactions. The idea that when it's prioritizing what to show you, because every day when you open up your newsfeed, there are tens of thousands of pieces of content Facebook could show you. But Facebook has to decide what 100, 200 pieces of content it should bring to the forefront to draw your attention to. And even within that set, what should it show you first versus what should show you 10th or 100th? Facebook, since about 2018, has used a process called engagement-based ranking. That means if content can elicit a reaction from you, a click for a like, a comment, a reshare, you sending it in a message to someone, that is considered a higher quality piece of content than content that does not elicit that kind of reaction. And I want to talk a little bit about how does a seemingly kind of dry technical choice impact our democracies and impact just our day-to-day lives. So on the most basic level, there's this question of what kinds of content gets engagement? What kind of content can move you to exert the effort to write a comment, move you to reshare it to all your friends? And just as Alexandra just hit upon, BuzzFeed wrote to Facebook very soon after this change and said, we believe there is a problem with your system. Once you change from prioritizing keeping people on your site, so it used to be their measure for success was the total amount of time you spent on Facebook. When they shifted to the number of reactions they could elicit from you, almost immediately, BuzzFeed said, the content that is succeeding the most from BuzzFeed on your site is the same content we are the most ashamed of. Content that played on racial biases, content that brought out the worst in humans. And that's because, to quote a member of the French Parliament that I unfortunately don't remember their name, the shortest path to a click is hatred. The shortest path to a click is anger. That we as humans have a neurological system that focuses on danger, right? It kept us alive on the savannah thousands, millions of years ago. But at the same time, that bias towards action in response to anger or danger becomes a problem when the information we get the opportunity to consume is prioritized on its ability to elicit that reaction. Facebook has made intentional product choices that are for its own benefit that happen to have the consequence of meaning the most angry, the most polarizing, the most divisive content gets the most reach. I have said over and over again, I am not a person who's standing on a soapbox yelling, we need more censorship. What I'm saying is that when we focus on good and bad ideas, instead of focusing on, is the product designed itself to be safe, we will not get the social media that we deserve, right? We need social. So when you post something to a group that has 500,000 members, 1 million members, and Facebook has to decide, okay, of all the content that came from this group each day, I have to pick out, 3 of 1,000 posts or 3 of 10,000 posts to put in your newsfeed. When we use that engagement-based ranking system, which content is going to elicit a reaction the most, it ends up being the largest reach goes to the angriest content. And that's a serious problem. Well, I'll give you a little context here. People have said the solution to bad speech is more speech. One consequence of giving more reach to angrier content is if I say something that is anger-inducing but is a lie, and you come back and give a reasoned response, you go to the trouble of writing research, you go and find all the links and include them in your post, and you post that, it is very likely that that post will get less engagement because it is thoughtful and reflective, it's complex. It's likely going to get less engagement than something that causes a knee-jerk reaction or something that confirms our own biases. I like to talk about the idea of information French fries. You know, French fries are delicious. You know, they're salty, they're simple carbs. You know, like, you know, we don't feel great if we eat too many of them. But they're a lot less complicated. You know, they hit those perfect spots in our brain compared to something more nuanced or more nutritional, like a dark leafy green. I think those are delicious too, but they hit you in slightly different ways. Right now, Facebook is allowing the French fries to run wild, and we are all facing information malnourishment as a result. I want to hit a second way that this becomes a problem. So it's not just this question of we can't have good speech counter bad speech, right? Because we're not allowing the good speech to be distributed. It also comes in the forms of ads. This phenomena, when combined with advertising, is one of the top existential threats I feel right now. So when ads are distributed on Facebook, Facebook prices them based on their quality. So the price of an ad, of a good ad, is cheaper than of a bad ad. But a good ad is an ad that elicits clicks, comments, reshares. At the same time, if the content that is easiest to get a reaction, a comment, a reshare is angry and divisive content, it means that running an angry, hateful ad is going to be 5 to 10 times cheaper than running a compassionate or empathetic ad, because that compassionate or empathetic ad is less likely to push you over the line to get a reaction. And in a world where political ads drive the consequences for our democracies, chaos will follow. And like Peter just said about this idea that you know, the ideas that we get to vote on in the ballot box are directly selected by social media. That is true, right? Political parties came to Facebook as early as 2018, within 6 months of them making this change, and said, hey, we know our constituents don't like a lot of the things that we're running, right? They have much more moderate positions, but we have to run them because they're the only thing that gets distribution now. It used to be 6 months ago, back when you were just trying to keep people on your site, that we could run an agricultural white paper and it would get distribution. It would get eyeballs. It might not get the most comments. It might not get the most reshares, but people got to consume that information. Now we get crickets. And democracies cannot function when the day-to-day information that we need to make good decisions, or the information that allows us to see each other as humans, doesn't get shared, doesn't get distributed, but the information that tears us apart, that makes us hate each other, that gets the most reach. And so as we stand on the verge of really, you know, putting our foot down and demanding a different relationship with social media, I want you to remember, we have done this before. Every time we've invented a new communication technology, we have gone too far, we've seen serious consequences, and we have figured out different ways to interact with that technology, because we value our democracies more than we value any specific technology. And we are in that moment, and I know we can make the changes that we need to get the social media we deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frances. Amazing as every time. Thank you. I switched to German because we have some international audience, but we have a lot of Germans in the audience and we have great interpretation. So I go back to German. Ich würde euch und Sie gerne alle auffordern, die Fragen, die ihr besonders
If you have any questions, or if you are reading any questions that you find particularly interesting, then you can vote them up. There's a little button that you can vote on the questions that you like, and then they'll come on top, and we will then read them out a little bit later. But I would also like to follow up on what Francis said, and then also react to the interaction between technology and democracy, and what we are doing right now to make sure that technology will serve our democracy rather than damage it. Just an aside, there's a video. Sorry, just interrupting myself. There's a video that we're going to play first. The French State Secretary for Digital Affairs, Cedric O, and he's going to head the trilogue next week as well on the DSA. Cedric O.
Good evening to everybody. I really want to thank Alexandra Geese for inviting me today and for giving me the opportunity to tackle the issue that you want to talk tonight, which I think is quite topical. Both from an institutional point of view, we are having a lot of discussion and negotiation around the Digital Services Act. I will come back to that later. But also because that question, the question of the tension between social network and democracy is something that is really a striving issue and has been something quite topical over the last years. And the debate that we've seen unfolding on the public domain. I do think that the problems that we're having and the issues that we have to manage have contradictory triggers. The first issue that we have to be able to deal with is the size of those platforms. There are two principles that are at the heart of the DSA that I think are key to understand what we want to do. The first one is transparency. So far, there are tens of millions, hundreds of millions of Europeans, billions of citizens of the world that are acting, playing, having social relation on those platforms, getting informed on those platforms. So they are shaping the way our economy, our societies, our democracies are functioning, with a lot of drawbacks, and we saw that last year, especially during Capitol Hill, but also in a lot of leaks, in a lot of discussion, in a lot of societal problems that we are encountering. The first problem that we are facing is the fact that they are acting as complete black box. As a French minister, but as a person that is responsible for the general interest, that has been elected for that, I do not have any idea on how many moderators in French language there are on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube. I cannot verify that. I don't know, and nobody knows why do you see that information instead of that information, how those algorithms are shaping our democratic framework. And this is a complete democratic nonsense. This is the question of transparency that is at the heart of the DSA. We should have some transparency toward the public power, toward independent regulators, but also to researchers. We know how important researchers were in discovering, in studying what happened last year in the US as far as this information is concerned. Second one is liability and responsibility of the platform. Obviously, there has been over the past decade a lot of debate between hosting and editors' attitude of the platforms. I do think that the solution is on a third way, and this is what at the heart of the DSA. The platforms, the social network, are not responsible for each content that are published on their services, but they're responsible for what they do, accelerating the content, editorializing the content, choosing that information instead of that information, choosing to take down that information. And they should be held responsible for that. And this is at the heart of the DSA. If the biggest platforms does not do their best effort in order to mitigate, to moderate, and to have the best approach in terms of moderation, then an independent authority should be able to find them and to force them to act, because they have a responsibility within our democracy and our economies. There is a last point that I want to stress is the echoes that we're having between the economic question and the democratic question. The main problem of those platforms is maybe coming out of the fact that they are acting as an oligopoly. So there are no independence between their market power, their economic power. The approach to tackle monopolies was based both on economic and democratic consequences of those monopolies. This is why we have on the table two texts, the DSA and DMA, that have a lot of echoes and that are designing a comprehensive approach as far as regulating the internet is concerned. The internet has been designed on a very libertarian approach, and that has been allowing a lot of innovation, a lot of democratic, but also social, but also economic innovation. The problem that we are facing is that in the loophole of that freedom, in the loophole of that, of the technical standards that are at the heart of the design and of the birth of the internet, it's the bad guys that have been taking the power. We have seen a lot of problems as far as cyber threats are concerned. We have seen a lot of problems as far as how authoritarian countries are regulating the internet. We have seen monopolies emerging. We are dealing on a day-to-day basis with cyberbullying, with hate speech, with fake news. And we have to design now an approach for the 21st century that is finding an edge way between freedom of speech, the freedom that is at the heart of the internet, and moderation and regulation, because at the end of the day, this is also a way to protect our citizens and to remind everybody that the choice that we have been making collectively offline should also apply online. So this is a story that we will have to work on a lot in the coming months and years. I do believe that both DSA and DMA will not be the end of the story, but only the beginning. But they are a very important step towards a more human, a more democratic, and a more free internet.
Ja, so, jetzt haben wir auch noch das Grußwort und die...
Okay, so that was Cedric O's video message as the State Secretary for Digital Affairs and of the French presidency. He's going to play a very important role in the political negotiations which are upcoming. And Francis Hogan just said that some political parties have said that the only messages which get through to people are ever more extremist messages. And if I remember correctly, that article, these were parties from Eastern Europe that said that. If not, Francis, please correct me later, who said that they needed extremist messages to get through, which is very interesting because in the European Parliament at the moment, we're really battling with loss of the rule of law and issues with the rule of law in some Eastern European country and disinformation there and a lack of a public discourse there. So it's interesting that you only have to go 3 years back to see that the political parties there knew it then, and we can see the results of this type of political strategy now. But if we want to prove that that's what's going on, we have to have the ability to do some research. We can't just make up theories, and for that we need the DSA as a legal foundation. So let's talk about the DSA. I, from the very beginning, have been a shadow rapporteur for the Greens, the European Greens at the European Parliament. So it's important to say that this is to do exactly what Francis demanded just now. It's not to say that this technology is bad, it's just not well regulated. And it's our task to draw up the framework, the legal framework, to make sure that this technology can serve our democracy. So that is necessary, and I think that's the first thing to realize, because sometimes when I talk to the press, they kind of have a defeatist attitude, and they say, well, these are global platforms, what can you do about it in Europe? That's not true. We can do something in Europe. And also in the US, there are lots of initiatives and bills in Congress and the House of Representatives to change things. And we do have very close contacts with legislators there. And I think the time has come to change things. So what is it that we would like to change? And I think the first thing about the DSA, I don't know if it's the most important thing, but the first thing that people tend to mention, and Felix mentioned as well in his presentation, Felix Kartte, is content moderation. who decides, what are the criteria to decide what can stay on the internet and what is going to be taken down. And in Germany, we have a law to at least do something against illegal contents and hate speech, but the results are not satisfying yet. The problem is that as soon as you start moderating content, that you're always almost limiting the freedom of opinion. So yes, that's an important tool, but it's not without its own risks. So we can't just leave it up to the platforms themselves to do it, because the German debate started saying, well, the platforms should just take everything down what they don't like, and then it's going to be fine. But that's not going to work, because platforms have an economic interest to make sure that the contents the most hate speech and disinformation are the ones that stay up because they make the money. That's a business model. We've just heard that. So the DSA has clear procedures, stipulates clear procedures for reporting procedures for users, and also clear lines how to deal with that for the administration, the authorities, and prosecutors, and the T's and C's. The T's and C's are the platforms which say what you may and may not post should be enforced coherently. So somebody like Trump or famous footballers can't just go on posting illegal contents that are in breach of the T&Cs without any consequence, and a lot of other content that does not breach the T&Cs is just filtered out automatically. So that is the first thing, the first important part of the DSE, so that you need this kind of content moderation to implement the T's and C's coherently in the same manner for all users. And then we have transparency reports, an obligation for an annual report by platforms on how they moderated contents, and that report has to be machine readable so that it's possible to really look at it. But what's more important, in my opinion, are two further parts of the DSA. First part, about surveillance, advertising, targeted ads. So can you use ads in a targeted way for specific groups? So for that, you need comprehensive data profiles, not just for groups, but for individual persons. And these data profiles aren't then just used for commercial advertisements. That wouldn't be so problematic, but it's really used to draw up the right content for a specific person. And Peter Pomerantsev has just explained what consequences that has politically. And so within the council and also in the parliament, there are divergent opinions on this. So in the council, that wasn't an issue. The ministers of economic affairs and for justice discussed it, and that wasn't a topic for them, discussed as DSA. But in the parliament, there was quite a dynamism to deal with this. In the Commission proposal for the DSA, there was something about transparency, but they just proposed that you need to show the criteria and make them transparent, why a specific person will receive a specific ad. So Twitter then will just say, well, we're transparent. We're telling you that you're going to see this, you're seeing this ad because you speak English, but you live in Belgium. But that doesn't tell me a lot. And it doesn't tell me what other people will see, what types of ads they will see, which is also interesting for me. So why do I receive specific ads? Well, I could probably come up with reasons for that myself, but I would also like to know why other people receive the ads that they receive. So that wasn't enough for us at the parliament. And in our first report, we managed to achieve a ban on such targeted ads, surveillance ads for children and teenagers, and also a ban on automated browser signals, so that you can't see the cookie banner every time So you have to agree every time with the question of cookies, and you don't even know what that means. So the browser can just say, no, I don't want any cookies from the beginning, and then you don't have to repeat saying it and saying it. We'd already tried this in the past, but we're going to put it in this regulation now. And there's another clause about a ban on so-called dark patterns, mechanisms on the internet, where you can see the yes, where you agree with whatever they want you to do, quite prominently in the center, but it's very difficult to find the no, where you reject what they're trying to make you do, and you don't even know where to look for it, and maybe you need several clicks to actually say no. So that's what we call dark patterns, and we'd like to ban that. And then there was a plenary vote on this a week ago, where we managed to achieve quite a success, mainly, namely a ban on targeting using personal data. So if we get that through the trilogue, it would mean that you're no longer allowed to target ads to people based on their political beliefs, their religious beliefs, whether they're a member of collective bargaining, what their sexual orientation is, and so on. So I think that should not be the basis on which content is selected for us. So that's why we want to ban on this. And if we can get this through, that would be a major success. Maybe to say something about the political background. So this was a demand from the Green Party, but also the European Greens, but also the Socialists and the left in the European Parliament, the Liberals and the EPP were really opposed to it. And I think that's very interesting. And there was a major lobbying campaign against that from Google and Facebook. So the first Commission proposal came in December 2020, and the Council adopted in October, last year in October, and the Parliament adopted its own position last week. And starting in August 21, a major campaign started by lobbyists from Facebook and Google in Brussels. And they really massively said that you should stop this part of the DSA because it would really cut into profits for Facebook mainly, but also Google, because they're really doing this targeted ads majorly. Because they have massive amounts of data and are very good at targeting their ads. And they control more than 70% of the German online market for ads, for instance, that used to go to editorial houses in Europe, but now it's really all to Google and Facebook. And this was the biggest campaign that Brussels have ever seen, and partially very successful. So it is quite the success of the Parliament that we still managed to win this vote. Then there's a second major part that's really interesting about the GSA. I think it's that whole part that means in future you can really look at what engagement-based ranking, Francis explained what that is, does to our society. So there's Article 26 is only for larger platforms. The DSA also covers smaller platforms, but this particular provision will only apply to platforms with more than 45 million users. So they will have to draw up risk assessments. And the first time I read it, I asked the commissioner, well, if the company itself draws up a risk assessment, is that really meaningful? I mean, does Facebook have any interest in saying, well, maybe our business model is a little bit problematic for democracy, but we don't care? Of course, they wouldn't do that. But the interesting thing about this article is that this risk assessment will then form the basis for independent researchers to come in and look at it. And so the Parliament wants to make sure that they should look at the effects of the business model that is used and the algorithms that are used on society, on human dignity, child protection, plurality of media, freedom of opinion, and democratic discourse. And that is quite a lot. That's a big scope. So I'm sure that the council will fight us on this, because the council is more keen on making sure that the mechanisms for the large platforms may be used from outside actors, but they just don't understand that the platforms themselves have an interest in this business. So we need independent surveillance. So we need at least once per year an audit of the entire platform. And this Article 31 is particularly important. It says that independent researchers need access to the data. And Felix just mentioned it, of course. There's research about this field, but as soon as they're a little bit critical, they no longer get access to the data, Facebook's data. So that's something that we would like to change. So now we would like to make sure that there's access to the data for independent universities and researchers under certain conditions. And the European Greens made sure that also NGOs will also get this access, because they were the ones, or the past years, together with Francis, of course, to really shed more light on the way these platforms work and how that affects our societies and why that is problematic. So that's what, those are the main achievements in the Parliament's report. And on Monday, we'll start negotiations with the Council and start defending these positions. And we're hoping to finish that this year, before the end of June, before the end of the French presidency, to really be able to adopt a type of constitution, digital constitution for Europe. Of course, that's not going to be the last word on digital affairs, but it should be a basis on which we can build, where we then, as a consequence of which we'll be able to find out what those mechanisms are. Francis told us a lot about this, but I think we will need a lot more empirical research, broad empirical research, and we also need the result. What does it do to a society in a specific country? So in Germany, for instance, why do we certainly have right-wing extremists together with nature lovers in one and the same demonstration against COVID measures? And why do we have this loss of the rule of law in a lot of Eastern Europe? So many questions, and we'll find the answers when we get the data, and we'll also find the reasons, so that we then, as politicians, can find a way to maybe change things. So back to Max for the discussion. And Max, you have the floor. Thank you.
Ganz herzlichen Dank an alle. Das war wirklich schon großartig, was man so in den Fragen schon
liest. Thank you very
much.
Thanks to you all. It was great what we can also already read in the questions and what is commented on Twitter. This is really very exciting. People are enthused about what they hear, also shocked by what they hear, but they're still full of hope. We have now around 80 questions that we received, and you have already voted many of these questions. We are going through them later. I'd like to take those questions first, which received the most likes. Hand them over to the individual members of our panel, and in a second round we will give you all the floor again, and we can see who wants to talk on what. So first we have here Lautaro Iriato with a question. She says, thanks, Francis Hogan, you're very courageous. Thank you very much. Thumbs up. And she has a question. Is there a realist effort to thrash Facebook's monopoly or to disappropriate the company? Which measures would make sense? And could there be a majority, a democratic majority for that? So that would be the atomic option to destruct Facebook. Maybe you want to begin, Francis, and then somebody else could speak on this topic too. Francis, please.
I think almost always when we're facing scary problems, we want magic bullets where we're like, oh, if we just did this one thing, it would fix everything. And one of the things that might initially seem like, oh, this is obviously the right answer is break up Facebook, right? Facebook is not one monolith. You know, it's a product Instagram, it's Facebook, it's WhatsApp, it's Oculus. There's a bunch of smaller things around it. Oculus is a VR headset. Part of what gives me pause when people push really hard for a break up Facebook is that the things that have caused Facebook to grow are not things that are going to be intrinsically fixed by breaking up Facebook, right? So when people say things like, we need to have interoperability, what does interoperability really mean? So let's say you broke up Facebook, so you have these different platforms. People say, well, I shouldn't have to choose where my friends are. Well, each of those products and experiences are pretty different, right? Like when you post onto TikTok, you have expectations, or when you consume TikTok, you have expectations of the kind of content you consume. Or when you go to Facebook, there's expectations of the kind of content you'll see there. When we say, there's this magic wand, if we break it up, if we have interoperability, it'll fix everything, it ignores the fact that the reason why Facebook got so big in the first place was it had the biggest network, and that people, when they post for personal social media, want their friends to reach it. And so if you have, if you think the market will magically solve this problem, I think you're probably going to be disappointed, because the problems that Felix and I articulated around engagement-based ranking, those repeat themselves in all those individual products. And as a general rule, a lot of the things around how safe these experiences are subtle things. It's not like if you were to drive a car and you're choosing between two cars and one has little tiny wheels and one has big wheels, and you're like, oh, I know if I have bigger wheels, my ride will be smoother in my car. A lot of these things, you might never know that you're dealing with a more dangerous or safer product if you just looked at the initial experience. And so everything we've talked about today about why we need transparency, mandated transparency, why academics and NGOs must have access to the data, is that we need to have a countervailing force that is not profit to hold Facebook accountable. Because right now, Facebook only has to give one guaranteed number out, or a set of numbers out. That's the financials it reports every quarter. Everything beyond that, they can lie with, and they do, right? They have a transparency center, but a lot of the things they choose to share, they choose because those numbers make them look the best. So for example, Peter talked about the idea that we are no longer having a shared conversation, that people are having different conversations with us. And Facebook said, you keep nagging us for more information, like being able to see what's there. Here, I'll show you the 20 most popular things in the United States, not in Germany, not in France, but in the United States, and that's it. Ignoring that their safety systems really only work on the very most popular content. They don't have systems that can scale, can take in and keep safe millions of posts. They can only do the highest touch ones. And so this is one of those things where if we want to have market competition, we still are going to have to come in and have laws change. Because if we just have market competition, the product that is the most addictive, that plays on, that gives us those information French fries, that's the one that's going to win. We don't say, we can have legal drugs and we're like, oh, there's competition. You can choose your addictive substance. No, we say we have to regulate these things. We have to, even if there is decriminalization, we have to have some system in place. And so I really believe that we have a unique moment where we can say, we know a little bit about how it's harming democracy. If we had more transparency, we'd probably learn even more. And once we actually are all having the same conversation about how we're affected, then we can have a conversation on what's the next step to change. but we have to start with at least having a shared conversation about what's going on.
Wunderbar, vielen Dank. Ich will mal auf Englisch antworten.
I'm going to answer in English. Thank you. But I see that Peter wants the floor, Alexandra, and I'm going to authorize a further question because Francis mentioned interoperability between the different platforms, Facebook, Messenger, Signal, Telegram. If I can change from one to the other, can I then really choose the product which is the best data protection and still keep my community? This is something we noted in Germany. Many people went from WhatsApp to Signal, for example. This would be another element on the question of breaking up Facebook, yes or no. What will it solve? Peter, Alexandra, and then Felix, please.
Speak about interoperability? No?
No.
Okay. Okay, good.
You can if you want, but you can also go to the original.
Yeah, I'll leave that to others. But I think it's very important when we have this debate about what regulation is important. And I completely agree with Francis that 20 data sucking rage machines is, if we break Facebook up into 20 of those, that hasn't, it's probably good for the economy. That's not necessarily great for democracy. So I'd like to sort of raise two issues when we think about regulation, and I'm doing this kind of very much aware there's people here who are really in the middle of this. One, let's look at history. We had a very similar debate about what do we do about a new technology called radio. When that appeared, that too, like the internet, was greeted with sort of utopian fantasies that it would be used to spread peace throughout the world and understanding between nations. Very quickly, it was seized on by, totalitarian forces, demagogues in America and obviously in Europe. And it took a time for democratic forces to react. And some of that is about regulation, what I would call kind of negative regulation, restraining regulation, sort of, accountability and curbing types of behavior. But we often forget about something I suppose one could call positive regulation. So in Britain, that led to going, okay, let's stop hate speech on media and so on and so forth, and incitement to violence, etc. But it was also things like, okay, but how do we create positive media? So in Britain, that led to the creation of the BBC, etc. And as we have this regulatory debate, it can't just be about the restraining bit, about the setting standards. We should also be thinking, how do we support, what a lot of people are calling civic tech? So technology which is designed not for profit, not for making money, not for sucking your data, but to improve civic discourse. Now we can have a very long debate. What do we mean by that? But I think that's very, very important. I mean, there was a horrible moment in the 1990s in Britain when the BBC, or its really clever people who work in strategy, said, hold on, we see this social media thing coming. We need something like the BBC for social media, something that will be non-profit, that will share good information, help people's civic virtues, they're better angels. And look, this is just rumor. This might be false news. I'm saying officially this is a rumor that people talk about in British government, but the government at the time said, oh, no, that would destroy the market. There's these great new companies, we can't get in their way. You can't have the BBC intervene. So we missed this chance. We must think about that now. We have a tradition of public service broadcasting. What would public service social media look like? Doesn't have to be state controlled, can be civic. And so I really want the regulators to think, how are you going to do that? How are you going to incentivize that? How are you going to give them tax break? How are you going to support them? How are you going to make sure they're independent of the state, obviously? So let's not just think about regulation as a negative thing, which is really important, but it'll also take positive moves. And I like the DSA. I like the digital, the Democratic Action Plan. And it seems to play with this sometimes. It talks about a European media space a little bit, but I don't see that fleshed out. I think it's actually very strong on the breaking up companies, very strong on transparency, definitely going in the right direction, way ahead of anything in the world apart from the British one, sorry. But No, but it's a very, very good start. I really mean that. But it hasn't thought about the positive enough for me, and we have to start thinking about that.
Soll ich weitermachen, Max?
Alexandra?
Ja, ich kann direkt noch mal anknüpfen.
Would you like me to continue, Max? Yes, I can link up with this. I think I concur with the previous speakers that it does not help that much if we break up Facebook unless we change fundamentally the business model and the rules for contents for this engagement-based ranking, because otherwise you have 20 companies who do just the same thing. But one has to ask also whether it makes sense that Facebook controls WhatsApp and Instagram, and the various data volumes are brought together, not in Europe, because here in Europe we have the pledge of Facebook, which they gave in talks with the European Commission. But can we really be sure? My phone number has not appeared in Facebook, but might be on black markets. It's probably sold on those markets because weird people call me, and I've never indicated my phone number and my Facebook account, so I have my suspicion, but no proof. But in the United States, that is legal, and whether then it makes sense that companies like Facebook control also Instagram and others, well, this is not a good idea, I think, but the monopoly authorities should have decided in a different way at the beginning. I found very important was Peter said, civic tech develop also technology products which are in the service of society. I can proudly say that we have this in Germany because I participated in the coalition treaty negotiations, and we stipulated it in this treaty amongst the parties who now form the German federal government. So I hope that the right things will come in this respect, but we also need competition conditions, i.e. a legal framework, which makes it possible for such political initiatives to grow instead of being bought by Facebook and then stopped. There are startups, but often they cannot impose themselves on the market because the market is dominated by large monopolies. The budget structure is responsible for the fact that not much is coming from Europe because the Commission cannot decide how the money is spent. That's what the member states do. That's why the positive initiatives come rather from the member states. I think the main reason for this is the budget structure at Europe. And I hope that there will be something coming from Germany. Then the idea of the public platform in Europe on which media companies unite in order to offer their media offer. We could also link up with a social media network, which is a public network, an idea which we have had in Europe for a few years already. And this could mean that such media companies and the public sector bodies find together. And in the Culture Committee of the European Parliament, we have works going on in this respect. I don't know how far they have come in the meantime, but there are developments, and I'm going to inform myself on this. This is an interesting thing. And as to interoperability, I think here there are differing opinions on this thing, not in the Digital Services Act, but in the bigger little sister of it, we have the Digital Market Act, which deals with rather competition or market aspects in this respect. And here we have the rule that there has to be interoperability, at least for messenger services, for which this can be put into practice relatively easily. So an interoperability obligation for the gatekeepers, WhatsApp as to the messenger services. This would mean that they have to offer interoperability for smaller services who then have to be interested in using it. This is the other question. Technically, this would be a relatively simple solution. When it becomes more difficult is when we talk about social networks, because here the questions become more complex. Which data can be used? Do you only exchange data and text? and text. How does it work? I know that Francis is relatively skeptical in this respect for several reasons, but some experts say that it's very easy, that it can easily be done. Maybe we need just more discussion here, more technical arguments, but in general, yes, in the DMA, we have first approaches in this respect. Thank you. Felix, please. I wanted to give you the opportunity to take the next question. Yes, there's something we can do. There is one question which has not appeared once, but several times, and which I think is for you. It refers to enforcement. How can these rules be enforced? Christian Bernard, for example, asks, do we need something like a press council or a media council? There's something we have already in the UK, a supervisory body, which decides if things are not possible, have to be taken off. So do we need official structures for this? Or how precisely should enforcement take place or be carried out? I know that in the framework of the DSA, there were negotiations on this, but this is a very general question. If we have strong rules, how can we make sure that they are enforced, and through which institutions? Felix, please. Well, this is an extremely important question, which we have to value very, very high, because in my mind, this depends on whether the DSA will bring something will depend on our ability to enforce things. If the EU does not develop the structures and the capacities, the resources to enforce these things, the whole law will not be helpful. So the debate on the General Data Protection Directive also went in this direction, said we should have supervision in Europe, not in the national countries. So it will depend very much on which data and user rights will be regulated, how they will be regulated, where you can put your request to. And I have something I'd like to mention in a more abstract way, something which Alexandra also mentioned. We can see that a paradigm shift is taking place here, that we have a strong law now, but we have a reactive regulation of content. That is also the case in the German network enforcement rule. But this means that normally we act only when the damage is already done. This is something we should maybe overcome, this purely reactive approach. We should be proactive towards the platforms and request certain things from them as regulator. Should really find out whether their measures are sufficient, also at the design level, to make sure that no harm is done to democracy, to fundamental rights, and so on. As to their recommender systems, for example, we could check this. And this is very exciting and very promising. I think this approach should not be too prescriptive. That we need a press council. We should rather be guided by results which are verifiable. And this is something which an innovative private sector could also cooperate with, I believe.
Zu der Frage Enforcement noch.
Thank you. Somebody else on enforcement? Maybe Alexandra. So what are the provisions in the DSA on this? Well, Felix already explained it. The Commission has proposed a procedure principal origin country. So wherever the platforms are based, and for the larger ones, that's Ireland. But we'd already seen with the GDPR that it doesn't really work, because Ireland is a very small country and trying to enforce rules for very global major platforms. So after a certain time frame, if nothing happens, the Commission can take over the procedure. That is basically the simplified explanation for what the proposal of the Commission has on that. So now the interesting thing is that the parliament didn't change a lot on that. There was no interest in the parliament to change that. The only thing is that we added some time limits, and that's very positive. So if after 3 minutes or 3 months, sorry, or 6 months, nothing has happened in Ireland, then the procedure will be taken over by the Commission. And for European policy freaks, the following will also be interesting. Normally, it's the Parliament saying the Commission should do it, and the Council says no, it should be the member states. This is really the opposite in this case. The Commission's proposal wasn't very ambitious, and the Parliament didn't really change that. But I have heard also after Francis Hogan came to Brussels, the Council then decided to give the Commission much further reaching competencies for surveilling the major platforms. So actually the Council's position on the Commission's competences is much, much broader. And that's a novelty, really, for the Council to want the Commission to have more power. So we'll see what happens. But it is encouraging that in terms of enforcement, what we're seeing there, the signals, and that I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Maybe I'll just, I found another question for Peter, and I think that's a great question, posed in English.
Listening to Peter, I would like to ask if politicians are the problem, drive the populist propaganda and misinformation, will politicians' messages be what the DSA protects us against? And are politicians prepared to have their content moderated?
So, I mean, look, we already have a lot of laws around speech. What is new around hate speech, which is different in different countries, but this exists, around incitement to violence and so on. There is nothing in the internet which has changed speech. It is not speech that needs new laws. What we need laws around are how that speech is distributed, targeted, amplified, the technology of it. We don't need any new laws around speech, frankly. This is a complete misprision of what is going on. Yeah, there is nothing new about what is being said. It was always said. It is how it is then technologically distributed. That's what needs regulation. So I just think, you know, I still actually believe that the best antidote to speech is more speech, but like all free market metaphors, it's a metaphor of the free market of ideas. That free market needs to be constructed in a way that we actually have genuine freedom and genuine pluralism. I believe in pluralism, but I do think the technology at the moment is rigged against pluralism. Yeah, you know, it's actually not pluralism. We don't have the transparency to have genuine interaction. So I'm still very old-fashioned. I still believe in these old ideas about debating and interacting, but that we have to have the technology that makes that possible. The technology at the moment is making it impossible. It's anti-democratic in its nature. So let's focus on the technology. These are actually, I think there's now elite consensus among lawmakers and among experts about the basics of it, you know, the transparency, et cetera, we're all kind of saying the same thing, which is great, because 4 years ago, we were all saying different things. So you know, there's a real unity now. But let's stop being distracted that this is about speech. It's not, it's about technology, and that's where the focus has to be.
Da würde ich gerne nochmal zurückfragen, weil das auch in den Fragen kam. Und
I would like to follow up with another question, because I've read that quite a few times, because many people have the question, maybe a question to Peter and also to Francis, but Peter first. So we have this targeting, and Greenpeace, for instance, Peter said, well, Greenpeace does targeting as well, but for a good purpose. So it's good targeting. But as a user, when you see the post, what would it look like? How could you tell who else will receive the same message, because somebody said, well, I don't know whether my neighbor will be targeted with the same message from the same party. So what will it look like to make it transparent for a user? Because these interactions on our platforms are only, they only last seconds, they only take seconds. So you like something within a few seconds. So how, in a practical sense, are you going to make it transparent for the user? Because the data are very complex.
You kind of mentioned du hast die Frage.
Well, you gave that example with transparency and Greenpeace. So yes, it's to you first, but of course to everyone else as well. How can this be visualized? Francis, please.
You're still muted.
I
You're
have
still muted. No,
I have
okay.
a kind of subversive thing, which is I don't think ads should be private, right? Like when we communicate with each other, like that's a thing where I think that we deserve to have privacy. Like I'm a strong proponent of encryption. But I do begin to ask questions around once you get into commercial speech, like ads in almost all their contexts are public, right? They go to lots of people. There are people who study them. And so there's this question of if you are sending out advertisements, especially political advertisements, we need to be able to get mass access to those. And Facebook intentionally releases those political ads in ways that are difficult to have transparency on. So they require you to use a very specific API that doesn't allow you to get a fire hose of all the ads. And people will go and have to query it over and over again in ways that it wasn't designed for, to try to get kind of a comprehensive view. So one, we should be able to get mass downloads of political ads at a minimum, if not all ads, in my opinion. The second is there are technologies at Facebook that already segment up the population into privacy sensitive categories. I know this because I developed the technology. I was on the team that developed the technology. And, you know, when we talked about that idea of that, when you have a country like the UK, you need what was it, 800 different messages, 80 core messages. In the United States, we divided the United States up into 600 buckets of people. They don't have labels on them. We're not saying who we think you are. We're just giving you an ID number, saying community 352. And if we were able to see the most distributed content, like the 1,000 most distributed pieces of content, 10,000 most distributed content to every one of those buckets, we would have a way, way, way more comprehensive view of what were other people seeing online. And once content is viewed by 100,000 people, is it really private anymore, right? Like, what is this line of privacy? Because right now, Facebook has been abusing GDPR and saying they can't give any data on anything, no matter how aggregate, no matter if it's seen by 1 million people because of GDPR, right? And so I think there's a real opportunity where if you could go, if someone like me could make a website and say, hey, do you want to see what your community is being targeted and how it's different than, say, people who live 100 miles away? That's something that could exist, that tool could. It doesn't violate anyone's privacy, but it would change how we would shape the messages and have conversations. Because if we want to believe that the solution to bad speech is good speech, we have to have an opportunity to respond. And right now, because we don't get to see behind the curtain, the only people who do are Facebook, we never get a chance to go in there and take our neighbors by the hand and say, so-and-so is lying to you, right? Instead, those lies get to fester in the dark. And so we have ways to do this. It's just Facebook chooses not to release these tools or release this data today, and that needs to change.
Thank you, Francis. Felix?
Ja, ich würde da gerne ganz kurz direkt anschließen.
I would like to follow up on this directly, because I also believe that this transparency just has to be enforced, because we do need transparency so that media and civil society actors can meet their task, and then we don't need a platform council, because then society will be able to take care of things itself. Just to give you two examples, before the federal elections, we were able to promote a project by the New York University, and they were doing exactly that, looking at political advertisements from parties, etc., collect them in a database base and also analyze it and the targeting criteria. So they invested money, employed research associates, and had the whole project. And then 3 weeks before they were starting, Facebook decided to delete their access. So, I mean, that was just talking about transparency, they just took it away. And I mean, another example for that, the same happened to Algorithm Watch. They wanted to make Instagram algorithms more transparent, and they suffered the same story. So we really need data access. I don't think there's no level of ambition that would be too ambitious in this area of transparency. And then I wanted to mention something else, because I think that we are focusing too much on advertisement in a narrower sense. So advertisement that comes from actual advertisers, specifically commercial actors or political actors, and what they can or cannot do. But the polarizing messages that we're criticizing, I mean, Facebook uses that themselves, and any type of content, private content as well, is used to make money by Facebook. So it's important to widen a transparency on that as well. So if you have sensitive data categories and you ban targeting based on these private categories, then that's great. But I'm actually gay, so I follow this TV show Drag Race on Facebook, and I know that 99% of those who follow that show are homosexual. So if I enter a homosexual in my targeting set, but I could still say, just target everyone who follow RuPaul's Drag Race, and then you basically have everyone who's gay on Facebook. So we really have to think about stopping that kind of mechanism. Thank you, Felix. Alexandra, you wanted the floor. I will try to keep it short. Just to speak about transparency briefly. So transparency, that's two different things. For one thing, it's the information that I have as a user of social networks, that I can see why I'm looking at a specific advertisement, a specific content. So you kind of have to simplify it to 2 or 3 or 4 criteria, because otherwise it's going to be too much. But then that is oversimplifying it. And it will probably mean that you won't really see why you're being targeted with this ad, because I speak English and I live in Belgium. I mean, that's not the only reason. My Twitter feed is very nerdy. I don't think that the housewife next door reading stuff in English and living in Belgium will get the same ads and the same content. So if you just focus on the main criteria, then that's not going to give you the real reason why you're seeing specific contents. But if you're really going to go into all that detail, you wouldn't be able to show that to the user every time. It would be too much. So, I mean, it has to do with how often did I visit a certain restaurant? Which doctor do I see? Who are my friends? All of that together will lead to specific assumptions about me. And that's not something that you can simply show to a user. And has that's the transparency towards the user. So that's very difficult. And then that's why I'm skeptical. But the form of transparency that Felix just mentioned, Felix Kartte, that you have large databases that are easy to search with access for NGOs and academics, and then they can use this type of information in a meaningful way, and then tell us in understandable ways what's happening, and give us that narrative. That is really important. That will sort of sway the battle here. And then the other topic that Felix mentioned, that we have these assumptions in our amendment to the Parliament's report. We also have this type of data, so incurred data, the assumptions that are being made because of the data that you have about someone. So if they follow the Drag Race, then they must be gay. So that's also going to be covered. You're not allowed to use those either. according to our amendment. And another interesting point, Felix said, well, people are then saying we can't use any kind of advertising anymore if you're not going to be able to reach people in a targeted way, but that's not true. You can place those ads on the drag queen side, because Google is always countering, saying, well, then we will make people pay. But that's not true, because you can still reach specific groups of people on specific websites, for instance, on that drag race website. So, but then it's transparent. You're looking at a specific website, and that's where you have a specific public interested in a specific type of ad. But you can see that not all problems are going to be solved by the DSA. It's going to be a work in progress, of course. Thank you. Thank you. Peter, you also wanted the floor.
You're muted.
So just following on from what was just said, transparency is not an end in itself. Transparency is the condition for the public sphere to start functioning. So I agree. Data that, you should have the right to know which of your data is being used to target you. Some people won't care. By the way, most people won't care because people just need to like or dislike messages. It'll be hard to find the balance between complicated and abstract and easy to use. That's not the point. But then it should be the role for journalists to explain it to people. We can't function as critics if we don't know what to criticize. We're also told we should have more media literacy. You can't have media literacy on a black box. You have to have something to interpret. So this could well be a new role for media, for journalism. Also, other parties will then be able to inform you. We shouldn't we should just have the transparency because it's a basic right. And then the way that it's used and debated and discussed is up to, the checks and balances of society. I just can't do that. During Brexit, we had no idea who was being targeted with who. How can we engage with it? So look, transparency doesn't magically solve anything. If people want to be Nazis, they will still be Nazis, even with transparency. We're not going to, people often want to be disinformed because it feeds their biases. All it does is create the conditions where we have a chance at democracy. I'm not saying democracy will win. I'm just saying at least we have a chance at it. So look, no law can solve information. Information and democracy will always be contested and dangerous and dynamic. It's only dictatorships that can create a law that controls everything. All we can do is create better conditions. And I think that's all we should expect from laws, by the way. That's all they can do.
Vielen Dank. Wir sind hier.
Now we have
5
minutes
minutes,
before our planned end.
and we've heard a lot and discussed many points. And Alexandra will take over now.
To Alexandra now for a conclusion. Maybe Alexandra, you could also answer 2 questions which are a little bit more general. First of all, are DMA and DSA in the European context are sufficient, or do we need more fundamental rights, digital rights, which go further? And then the question, what happens with companies who don't have an interlocutor in the European Union? Telegram, for example, cannot be reached by European authorities, according to this question at least. And then I would like to thank the entire panel. Thank you very much. Also on behalf of Europe Calling, it was a great panel. And now Alexandra Geese for the conclusion and the final words. Thank you very much. I'll start with the last question. Telegram is a debate, which is a very heated debate in Germany at the moment. All platforms will need a representative in Europe. That a platform cannot be reached by authorities in Europe. This will, after DSA, not be the case anymore. And this is quite some progress. And then I would say the Telegram debate should not be overvalued, overrated, because these are questions also of criminal law to find out what is illegal. And sometimes it's not so difficult to find out who the responsible people are, who the culprits are. And then the radicalization. I believe that it stems from other platforms, from Facebook or YouTube, and then people go to Telegram into those groups once they are already radicalized. But in order to have proof for this, we need research and more transparency. But as to the German debate, I would say let's not look too much only at Telegram. Then the question, are DMA and DSA enough, or do we need digital basic fundamental rights? This is an exciting question. I think we have digital fundamental rights in the European Declaration on Fundamental Rights. We have also something on data protection and privacy. I would say that this fundamental rights catalog is sufficient. The question is, how do we implement it in today's digital environment? This is the problem we're having at the moment. And another very interesting problem is the question, how can we balance fundamental rights against one another? Freedom of opinion, for example, is important, but does it mean that I can say always everything? Or does it mean that as many people and groups as possible can participate in the societal discussion and are not pushed outside by hate speeches, something which happens a lot today as to women, as to people of color, as to people with an immigration background who do not dare anymore to speak on the internet. Research says that over half of the women say that they don't give their opinion on the internet, and this is a restriction of the freedom of opinion, I think. So we need a balance here, and in the digital space, this question becomes new importance and becomes particularly tricky. This is something which cannot find an easy solution. It needs discussion also in our legal systems. So I don't really know, honestly, whether we need new digital fundamental laws. Perhaps yes, perhaps no. Maybe we can use those we have, the digital legislation. Well, I think in this respect, we need more digital use protection. This is a matter that has not been clarified by the DSA. So here we need more, but we should also build on all the things that the DSA would give us. So instead of a final word, I'd rather advocate for the following. I think you all understood tonight how complicated the debate is, how strong the interaction is between platforms and democracies, and we haven't even been able to talk about such spaces outside Europe, platforms outside Europe. But the attack on the Capitol on January the 6th, I think, has showed us how difficult the problem is. We have the Philippines, for example, also a very interesting example. And there are many other countries or places we don't have on the radar. But what we understood tonight is that issues like engagement-based ranking, spying of contents, and then the interaction between people of hatred, that this is extremely linked to radicalization, to more extremism in our societies. And with the fact that more and more people in our society cannot be reached by rational arguments anymore. And that this debate, my opinion, your arguments, my opinions, is a model that cannot work anymore because people are not accessible anymore for such arguments. What I would like to say to you all tonight is that this is not about technology. This is about democracy. This is about the question how we all want to live together. And therefore, I think it's important that we all interest ourselves to these things, and that we don't say, well, these okay, now we have it. No, this is about the core of the democracy, and I think this is something that's been written by somebody who can explain these things well. And I think this is a topic we should mention often in all the debates in which we participate, that we don't only ask why are there so large COVID demonstrations because there is so much alternative medicine or whatever. There are many explanations which, yes, are interesting, but we also have to see that it has to do with the platforms too. And here, the functioning of the platforms is what we have to understand. The next months will be extremely interesting. We will soon start the negotiations between the European Parliament and the Council, and the position of the federal government will be important in this respect. And I, as a Green member of Parliament, who fought a lot for restricting targeting and for giving a right to the NGOs to get access to data, to be able to do effective research, I would really be happy if the federal government and the Council would also be quite forthcoming towards the Parliament so that this digital democracy will be possible. So a very interesting debate in the next few months we should follow. And another thing I'd like to mention before we close, there is also this large movement in the United States, a very interesting movement against the so-called surveillance advertising. A lot happens in Congress in this respect, and therefore I think it's very important that we see to it that we realize that it's not a debate against American companies. It's a debate that regards us all, the Americans, us, the civil society, especially in this democratic Western space. So we need a digital space with legislation that ensures that it's a democratic space, with freedom of opinion, with freedom of speech, because the times will not become analog times anymore. As a social solution cannot be to simply not use Facebook, but we should definitely see that it's not one continent against another here. I'd like to thank you all, our guests, our fantastic guests we had tonight. I think that these were very interesting insights, sometimes also new for me, but I've been working on these topics for 2 years now. So on behalf of Europe Calling, thank you very much to Felix Kartte, to Pomerantsev, I think, who was able to very concisely present us with these complicated issues. Thank you very much to Francis Hogan. Thanks for being with us, and thanks for everything you've been done last year. Thank you very, very much. And I'd like to thank the interpreters too, who we should not forget. They struggled hard tonight. Thank you very much. And I wish you all a nice evening. See you at the next Europe Calling.